So, welcome everybody. And this is the first session we're going to be doing where we're going to be deep diving into Marshall McLuhan, who is one of the big media theorists, really. And I hope by the end of today's session, we'll have begun to get a bit of an understanding of what this video means about how the electric age is transforming everything. So to begin with, I'm going to take you through a few slides and basically present to you what I think, to me, is the most kind of valuable idea I find in Marshall McLuhan, and then attempt to try and explain how I use these to kind of decode contemporary culture at the moment. And then Andrew's going to talk for a while about some of the McLuhan ideas he likes, and then we're going to open up for discussion. I think one of the things to bear in mind when talking about Marshall McLuhan, like last time we were talking about shamans, this dude is a true fucking shaman. The way he saw the world, the way he thought about the world was incredibly trippy, to the extent that often he actually said, I don't always agree with the things I myself say. Very almost like schizoid in that respect. And also towards the end of his life, he also said at one point, when I read books, I only read one half. I read the right-hand page and not the left-hand page, and I let my brain fill in the other half. So that gives you a bit of a kind of sense of the sort of guy we're talking about. Anyhow, I'm going to take you through a series of images that show you different depictions throughout the kind of history of Western art. You've got this one here, this vase. And just notice what you see about the different images, how they're composed. So there's a little story going here that I'm just going to go through very quickly because it connects very nicely to McLuhan's ideas about different leaving the world and how perception of an ancient Greek vase. And basically, you've got a depiction of some kind of battle scene, probably from mythology. And the way it looks, it's like everything's happening at once and it's in completely 2D perspective. Like reality doesn't look like this, but you get a sense of this battle. Now we move into a medieval Christian depiction. And again, it's still got this sense of cartoon-likeness and it's two-dimensional. We move into the early Renaissance and we're starting to get more of an attention to 3 dimensions and to perspective. You kind of get a sense that you could actually be standing there watching this happening. Similarly here, and now you see also there's an attention to the background, there's an attention to the different layers and the perspectives that stack up in the background, which again is what we see here. It develops and it becomes more and more, if you will, kind of realistic until we get to a point with about the 17th or 18th century art. And then it's like high realism. The artist is trying to depict reality, genuine reality, not just mythological themes, but just some nice dances and as faithful to what it looks like as possible. And then we get an interesting thing where we go into the Impressionistic era in the 19th century, when all of a sudden we're kind of back to that cartoony effect. All of a sudden it's not so much about being visually true to what that scene of this party looks like as trying to capture and express the feeling, the overall sensory feeling of what it's like to be there, the blur, the chaos, the hecticness of it. And then we get into these 20th century stuff. We've got Cubism and we've got all of these perspectives stacked on top of each other. It's like there's multiple scenes happening all at once. And then finally, and this is just something I pulled from Google Images. This isn't a piece of high art from any canon or anything, but I think it kind of says quite nicely about what a 21st century kind of depiction looks like. So the key idea I find in McLuhan is this distinction between what he calls visual space. And to get a feel for this, just like you guys for a moment to look away from the computer screen. And first of all, just pay attention to like actually what your sight, how it interacts with things. Not so much the objects themselves, but as to how visual space is structured. everything has a place in visual space, and there's only one thing in a space at a time. And generally, the objects in the space keep their space there. They're there. They might move over a long period of time, but they last. And then, if you close your eyes and now pay attention to what sonic space, or what we might call acoustic space, feels like, how you make sense of it, all of a sudden there's no longer particular places, particular discrete locations with objects in them. There's sounds that come and go. They stack up on top of each other. And when they stack up on top of each other, they can produce interesting resonances and harmonies that are kind of context dependent, but interesting. And that's how music works. So McLuhan's idea was that different media, different forms of expressing and communicating information rely on different senses and privilege different relationships between the sensory fields. And now my slide is frozen. Right, here we go. So if you think about the ear, and you think about how humans were telling stories, narrating things around campfires for a long, long time. And in fact, most of our history. And what happens when you tell a story and you tell it with gestures and with sound? There's resonances, there's ups and downs that you can go very quiet and very intense. And then you go really loud and really fast. And the story's it disappears the moment the teller has stopped telling it. But you're completely involved in the telling of it while it's happening. Similarly, in fact, while I'm giving this lecture, there's deep involvement in what I'm saying. But then you compare that to something like writing. What happens when you're interacting with ideas that have been written down? Well, typically you do it on your own. You're not in a tribe anymore. You're not around a campfire. There's no speaker. There's no gesture to it. There's just the page and the words. And the words have this property of being kind of eternal, not necessarily eternal forever. They might get burned or whatever, but much more long-lasting than words of a storyteller. And we got this quote here. McLuhan proposed that Western society's attraction to linearity is caused by the phonetic alphabet, which shrinks our human speech and thought into 26 characters. The result, a worldview dominated by the linear logic and the symbolic abstraction of meaning. What this means is that as we increasingly move towards a world of writing, and we looked more to books and newspapers to communicate the deepest truths rather than voice, we started to see the world more like visual space is structured, linear, everything in a specific place where it belongs. Abstractions, rather than all the ups and downs and frequencies and gestures of spoken communication, you just have these 26 symbols, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and everything can be expressed in 26 symbols. So what does art look like in an acoustic or an oral culture? We'll go with acoustic in a culture of the ear. We'll look at this vase again. Everything's happening all at once. You can kind of imagine that if you were there at that battle and you shut your eyes, and then you drew a picture of what it sounded like, it might look something like this. Whereas in a high literary culture, say in the 18th century, the art looks like this, attempting to be as true a depiction of reality as it looks visually as possible. So what do we think happens when we get to the age of the radio and the television? Well, this is interesting. So Marshall McLuhan thought that the TV and the radio take us back to this era of oral storytelling. It's about the ear again, and it's about gesture. Now, of course, the TV is visual, but the point about when we're in extreme visual space is that it privileges just the visual abstraction, the written letters over everything else, whereas the TV gives you sound as well as image. It gives you movement. And so it's much more like this mythic storyteller. Here we see the electric age brings us back into this acoustic space. Marshall McLuhan at one point says the radio was beating the tribal drum. And what about today? Well, we've got YouTube and podcast, and that's basically just the extension of television and radio. I mean, or not, maybe like we will talk later about how YouTube and podcasts and the various social media technologies interact with us. But you can kind of think YouTube is still moving pictures on a screen with sound, and podcast is this voice that describes things to us. And of course, we look at our depictions of art from the 20th and 21st centuries. They look acoustic. They're closer to that ancient Greek vase than they are to our high realism of the 18th century, say. All of these overlapping perspectives and multitudes and resonances. It's like you could kind of be there, but nothing exactly looks like that. Here's another quote from McLuhan. Until writing was invented, man lives in acoustic space, boundless, directionless, horizonless, in the dark of the mind, in the world of emotion. Like I said, everything's happening in all at once and resonating with each other. Now, today, after more than a century of electric technology, we've extended our central nervous system into a global embrace, abolishing both space and time as far as our planet is concerned. In other words, what McLuhan is getting at is that with our digital electronic technologies, we've thrown ourselves back into what he calls the dark of the mind, where it's directionless, horizonless, the world of emotion. This world of the literate man, of the visual man, of linearity and discrete places and everything kind of fitting together nicely is gone. We're back here. And now, just to close, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the different outlooks structure how ideologies and organizations play out in the world. And this is my interpretation of McLuhan more than McLuhan himself. So the literate outlook, it gives us this sense that we're all like that abstract visual code, like the letters. So remember what literacy did. It takes all of the ups and downs and the context dependency of vocal communication and turns it into 26 A, B, C, D, E, F, Gs. And then you can do everything with them. So the idea of the individual and individualism, which rose at about the same time as literacy was getting really as the predominant mode of communication around about the 16th, 17th centuries, that is the ideology. Humans are all the same. There might be differences in how our bodies are and how our skins are and blah, 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 but we're all individuals, and that's the appropriate way to think about humans. Similarly, the literate outlook gives us this focus on universal scientific truths, objectivity, truths that are eternal, like the words on the page that once they're written down are there forever. Linear, it's rational. If you know Alexander Bard's theories, this is what he calls logos. So a visual literate culture privileges this very rational, very logos of the world. And humans organize in these bureaucracies, because if you're the kind of paradox about individuals is that everybody's different, but everyone's the same in being different. And rather than being connected, like, oh, we're Catholics and you're Muslims and you're Protestants and blah, 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 we're all individuals. And the ultimate dream of the individualist world is that everybody's going to be individuals and we can do away with these arbitrary distinctions between people or whatever. You know, that's what the idea of a uniform is really about, is getting rid of the differences so you can just relate to each other as individuals. So what about the acoustic outlook? Well, we've been saying that the acoustic world is very context dependent, resonant. Things are not just abstracted. Things depend on a particular place. And so any kind of universalism is a kind of oppression, is a kind of attempt to constrain human being into a box that doesn't quite fit it. The acoustic outlook likes a mythic understanding, a truth that is alive, subjective, context dependent, what Alexander Bard calls mythos. And here we've got Jordan Peterson, who famously brings back mythic thinking to our consciousness. We've got Michel Foucault, who's all about the context dependency of truth. And then this nice Jung quote, the most important question anyone can ask is, what myth am I living? I think if you said that to someone like Richard Dawkins, one of our high rationalist people, he'd be like, fuck off. The most important question anyone can ask is, I don't know, something scientific. And lastly, right, the acoustic outlook. Humans have different bodies, desires, and experiences. And they organize themselves not as individuals where we're all the same as individuals, but into these tribes, into these subcultures, the sexual identities, gender identities, places, heavy metal, hippies, anything that gives us something about the particular context of our existence, as opposed to an abstract code. Someday is that the ground of the latest Western technologies is electronic and simultaneous, thus structurally right hemisphere and aural or acoustic in its nature and effects. But the overwhelming pattern of procedures in the Western world remains linear, sequential, connected in political and legal institutions, and also in education and commerce. In other words, our technologies are pushing us to be like these acoustic people, these tribal people that were very, very interested in the particularities of our experience and in mythic understanding and mythic experiences, and not so much in these abstract, high rational ways of being. And yet our entire societies, from our bureaucracies to our political and legal systems, have been built on these principles of linear abstraction, rationality. He called it a formula for complete chaos. And I think this is the place where we're basically at in society right now, thinking, what the fuck do we do and where do we go next from there?
Thanks for watching this conversation. If you enjoyed it, then please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and put in a comment below. If you want to see the rest of the video and take part in future conversations like this, then check out the link to our website in the description below. Thanks.